In Climate Watch, an alarming new study published Wednesday says scientists discovered microscopic particles of plastic in snow from the Alps into remote regions of the Arctic. The findings, published Wednesday in the scientific journal Science Advances, are part of a growing body of evidence showing particles from plastic waste end up in our water, soil, and air. Roger Harrabin, with our partners at the BBC, has more.
The Arctic, a place of pristine beauty. Smothered with snow, clean and pure. Well, that's how it appears, but it's an illusion. Arctic snow is tainted with microplastics and rubber particles and clothing fibres. Given the amount of pollution in the atmosphere, it's perhaps hardly surprising that we're finding microplastics in snow. But we have such a strong belief in the essential purity of this stuff that some people will find this news rather shocking. Dr. Melanie Bergman led the research. First stage involves a bit of low technology, a dessert spoon and a flask.
I think we're not treating our planet very thoughtfully. Basically, we produce all these packaging materials. We cover everything in polymer-based varnish. We use a lot of rubber, which we also find in our aerial samples, snow samples, and don't even think about what is happening to this in the environment.
But few people live here. Where on earth do the pollutants come from?
We know that most of what we are analyzing up there and measuring are long-range transported pollution, coming from the continent, coming from Asia, coming from all over the world. And some of these chemicals have properties that are a threat for the ecosystem, for living animals.
Scientists have found that air and sea currents drive pollutants north. Last year, we broke the news that Arctic sea ice had more microplastics than anywhere in the ocean because floating particles get bonded into the ice as it freezes. We found plastic pollution on the Arctic beaches. Some of this debris had drifted for thousands of miles. Tourists still trek here to experience what appears to be wilderness, creating their own pollution on the way. How do locals feel about plastic in snow?
Sad. It's, of course, this is, I'm still young and this is what I have to continue to work with and to make it all better. I'm here to show pure and clean snow and dogs and the Arctic nature, and that's what I hope to do for the rest of my life. And if it continues this way, I will not be able to.
When I hear that, my heart is crying, and I feel really terrible, and I'm not satisfied what I hear. But it wakes me up, it wakes my company up that we have to do something. So it's not good news, but we must not give up. We must start to fight against this. What can we do?
It is not surprising, and it just makes you really, really sad. And it up here you look around you every day and you see something that you think is the pristine Arctic, as it's called, and it's not anymore. And we see it every day, and it's really, really sad.
Here's the truth. There is nowhere on the planet to escape pollution from us, however hard you run. Roger Harrabin, BBC News in the Norwegian Arctic.
Dr. Melanie Bergman is a marine biologist and plastic pollution expert at Germany's Alfred Wegener Institute. She's the lead scientist of that study, and she joins me now from Bremerhaven. Dr. Bergman, thank you so much for being with us. When we think of the Arctic, we often picture a remote, pristine area of nature. So how are microplastics ending up in the snow there?
Yeah, that's a big question. We actually found huge amounts of microplastics in Arctic sea ice and in deep sea sediments before. So this was the reason why we actually started to look into the ways of how all this microplastic could end up in the Arctic. And because colleagues from France and China found microplastics in samples from the air before, we thought that snow could be a good another option of transport, along with the thermohaline circulation with the ocean currents. And yeah, because snow is known as a scavenger for any particles in the air, we basically sampled snow and analyzed this in the laboratory for microplastics.
And so you found these plastics in the snow, these microplastics. Were you able to determine the source of these particles?
This is a little difficult. What you can determine, you can say, well, we found different polymer types, for instance, polyethylene, which is the main material of packaging, or we found a lot of polymers which are used in varnish, or a lot of different types of rubber, which can be from car tires, but a lot of different technical applications as well. So that's really the hard part, to pinpoint it to different sources.
And at this point, do you have any theories as to how it got there? I mean, were these particles so tiny they just rose up into the air, or were they in the water that got evaporated? Do you have any theories?
A lot of the particles that we found were actually varnish, and at the beginning we were thinking, well, how does varnish get into the air? But if you think of it, there's a lot of surfaces which are actually coated with polymer-based paints, like cars, offshore constructions, and even the facades of houses are nowadays often painted with polymer-based coats. So basically the wind is blowing against it, and also you have a lot of UV radiation, and much in the same way as with larger plastic items, this then leads to degradation of these surfaces, and these particles become loose and get blown off with the wind. And yeah, it's not so surprising when you do a little more research, because, for instance, dust from the Sahara can be transported over distances of 3,500 kilometers. So they end up in the Northeast Atlantic. Or, for instance, pollen, which was, emitted by willow and pine trees in Central Europe, ends up on Svalbard in the Arctic. So within actually 5 days. So these particles can travel very fast, long ways.
So, Doctor, how worried should we be about this? I mean, do these microplastic particles in the air or in the snow pose a health risk to humans or animals?
Well, that's a big question, and unfortunately we cannot answer this, because for some strange reason there's no research being done on the effects of microplastic on human health. There's quite a lot of research undertaken on the effects of animals, but strangely we don't know much about the effects, especially of inhaling this on human health. There has been a study in 1989 where they found microplastic in human lungs, but this is as much as we know so far.
You said that there has been a lot of research into how this is affecting animals. What have those findings been?
They are kind of contradictory. Some studies, for instance, on mussels found that they showed an inflammation response, and in some worms you find, marine worms, you find a decreased growth rate, decreased reproduction, fertility, and some animals suffer from higher mortality in laboratory studies. But then you also find organisms which seemingly only ingest these particles and ingest them. So it's a little bit difficult at the moment to have a complete picture. We need to do more research. But what we do know is that we should reduce our plastic consumption.
Absolutely. It's fascinating talking to you. I just wanted to back up for a second and drill down on exactly where you found the particles. Were they attached to the snow? Were they attached to individual snowflakes, or were they sort of separate in the snow?
That we cannot really tell, because basically we took the snow sample, defrosted it, and we poured the water through a filter, and everything, all the particles on the filter was then scanned with a Fourier transform infrared spectrometer. Sorry about the name, and all the particles were then compared with polymers in a reference library, so you could match them up and quantify different types of plastics in the sample.
All right. Well, fascinating talking to you about your research, Dr. Melanie Bergman. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome. Thanks.